Jesus once encountered a man who had been born blind, and his disciples asked him, Master, was this man born blind because of his own sin or because of the sins of his parents? At first, that may seem like a very strange question. First of all, why would he be born blind because of his own sin? It's true, the man was born into sin just like the rest of us, but if blindness was the punishment for the sin he was born into, why aren't we all born blind? And if blindness was the judgment for the sins of his parents, why weren't they struck blind instead of him? Why punish an infant for the sins of an accountable adult? But the disciples were just trying to make sense of the man's suffering. Apparently, he'd done nothing terribly wrong, at least as far as they knew, or else they would have concluded that he had brought this judgment upon himself, and they wouldn't have asked why. All they knew was, for some reason, he'd been doomed to a life of poverty and helplessness. And they wanted to know why. When we see someone suffering, or when we find ourselves suffering, that's often the first thing that crosses our minds. Why? Why is this happening? Why him? What did he do wrong? Why us? Why me? Sometimes there's a logical reason. If you eat mainly junk food and don't get enough exercise, then you should have a good idea why you aren't healthy. If you spend more money than you bring in, then you know why you're in debt. If you do the wrong thing, there are consequences. We may not like admitting it, but we all know it's true. But often our circumstances or those we observe in the lives of others simply don't make sense, even when stacked against behavior. A teenage girl is killed by a drunk driver and taken from her loving family. A firefighter with a wife and children loses his life in the line of duty. Thousands of people are forced to live in squalor in the shadow of mansions just because their skin tone is too dark or they were born in the wrong zip code or country. A nurse works long hours trying to keep victims of a debilitating respiratory plague alive, only to find herself futilely fighting the same disease 2 weeks later. These things all happen all around us every day of our lives. And we often ask, why? Why do these things happen? Why would a loving God allow so much suffering? When the disciples asked Jesus why this man had been born blind, they weren't even considering a loving God. They were thinking about the God of judgment and wrath, and it still didn't make sense to them. Is he being punished for his own sins or someone else's? Jesus' answer was as profound as it was simple. He said, He's not being punished for anyone's sins. This man was born blind because God wants to show himself to you through his glorious work today. Jesus went on to explain that his reason for being among them was to do the work of God. Then he miraculously healed the man's blindness right there before their eyes. So, why does a living God allow suffering? Well, in the case of this blind man, he did so because he is a loving God. Many of us are preparing for an event next month. The 6K for Water that our church sponsors as a partner with World Vision involves, for many of us, running about 4 miles. For others, it involves walking about 4 miles. And for a few of us, or perhaps more than just a few of us, it involves trudging, slogging, stumbling, lumbering, and toiling for about 4 very long miles. Now, some of us stay in pretty good condition and are always ready for a run. And some are in good enough condition that a little training will get them ready for a 4 mile event. But being in that kind of shape isn't an act of will. It doesn't come by wishing or wanting or just feeling like it's a good idea. It takes a lot of effort. It takes work. And it often involves some degree of pain and discomfort. The same goes for love. If you want to love someone, it's going to require some work, inconvenience, discomfort, sacrifice, pain. It takes an effort. Satan bombards us constantly with the notion that love is a matter of how we feel about someone. That's because he wants us to be satisfied with the feeling and not concern ourselves with the doing. But contrary to popular belief, love has absolutely nothing to do with how we feel. It's all about what we do. And God gave the ultimate example. Jesus told us God loved the world, you and me, all of us, so much that he, what? Felt over the moon every time he thought about us? Got such a warm, wonderful feeling of joy and happiness just from being with us? No, that's no measure of love. God loved the world so much that he gave, and not of his wealth by creating cool stuff for us that he thought we might that might make us feel good. He gave his only son. He reached beyond his pockets, beyond his creative power, and into his heart and soul and very nature, rending himself and suffering pain, grief, judgment, and death for us. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Today we celebrate Christ's resurrection, and in so doing, we must acknowledge his sacrifice. And how do we do that? He gave us a hint when he offered the bread and wine to the disciples. He broke the bread and said, "This is my body. Consume it so that it becomes part of you." He gave them the wine and said, "This is my blood, shed for the remission of sins. Drink it, all of it." When the blind man woke up that fateful day, he probably had no idea that his lifetime of suffering would suddenly assume eternal significance for countless people for ages to come. The chances are he lived the rest of his life on this earth never fully aware of the extent to which he had become a fellow laborer with Jesus that day when his suffering was miraculously dovetailed with the suffering of Christ. Of course, he had no choice in the matter. He was blind from birth. He couldn't do anything about that. When the time came, his sacrifice had already been made. But now we are confronted every day with opportunities to throw our backs into the work of Jesus Christ, to be fellow laborers with him, to allow our flesh and his to be fused, our blood to be mingled with his in sacrifice, to be essentially his body. His reason for being in this world was to do the work of God. When we come to him, our reason for being here is the same. This is real, folks. It's not religion. It's not a ritual. Taking communion is basically telling Jesus, I'm in. I want to be part of this. Just like the man who lived a lifetime of poverty and helplessness just so that on one day Jesus could demonstrate the love of the Father, I am here to do whatever I'm called to do, to be a vessel, an instrument of God's love. Being called by the Father to become laborers with Christ is reason enough to do so. But there is a reward. You see, when Jesus emerged from the tomb, he not only secured our redemption, but our resurrection as well. And a lifetime of suffering and laboring beside Christ is nothing compared to eternity rejoicing in his presence.